Our first question is, when you hear the word monument, what do you think of? Do you have a personal connection to any monuments or memorials?
When I hear the word monument, I think of some kind of external representation of someone or something, a person or an event, that is considered not only in a positive light, but as something which people should remember because it contains lessons relevant not just to what's referred to in the monument itself, the person's life or the event when it occurred, but for all time. In other words, monuments have a universal relevance.
When you hear the word monument, what do you think of? Do you have a personal connection to any monuments or memorials?
When I first hear the word monument, I think of an object that is part of public memory and is also trying to create public memory. I think monuments tend to have two functions. When I think of monuments, because I'm a Japanese historian, I think of things like the atomic bomb dome in Hiroshima. I think of the Olympic Stadium in Tokyo that was built in 1964 for the Tokyo Olympics. I think of the statue of Saigo Takamori, one of the leaders of the Meiji Restoration in 1868, which is in Ueno Park in Tokyo. So I think of those kinds of places and the monuments they hold.
So when you think of when you think of the word monuments or statues, what comes to mind?
When I think of monuments and memorials, that can be a variety of things. That could be a monument or a memorial to a specific person, or it could be to commemorate a certain event. For example, when we think about monuments, we think about even, oh goodness, I just totally drew a blank. When we think about the Washington Monument in DC, right? Like that is pretty much an ode to our first president, or even the Lincoln Memorial, right? Just look using DC as an example, right? Lincoln Memorial is this somewhat of a shrine of sorts to encapsulate a person. Or when we think about monuments that capture events like World War II or wars or historic events that that the public feels should be commemorated. Although that can be a tricky subject depending on which event that you would want to commemorate. So those are the things that come to mind when I think of monuments and memorials.
When I think of monuments and memorials, I think of like statues or like public like displays that commemorate anything. I mean, they commemorate past historical events, past historical figures. They are meant to be respectful to the event they are commemorating, but also the people within their community that the statue or memorial has been placed in. When I think of them, I often think of the 9/11 memorial in New York City, or I think of the Vietnam memorial in DC, like that big wall with all the names on it. Yeah.
I think monuments and memorial, what really comes to my mind is the past and past history. A lot of it about our country, what we endured, but I've also traveled to Europe and, I've noticed and I've seen a lot of monuments there, many more than what we have here. So that's probably the first thing, history.
I generally think of like monuments as a piece of history or a way of remembering a specific person or a specific event that happened at a specific place.
Oh, when you think of monuments and memorials, what's the first thing that comes to mind?
I think of when I see a monument and a memorial, I think of great people, the people that deserve to be credited for what they've done.
All right, that's good. And off the top of your head, who's the first person that would come to your mind? Like, what's the first monument that comes to you?
Well, the first monument that comes to my mind right now is Columbus.
Okay.
Because people are trying to take him down.
Yeah, it makes sense.
And other than that, you know, I think that there should be a Columbus monument.
Okay.
If he didn't come and be here, you wouldn't be here, and I wouldn't be here.
Of course, I agree with that point. Put some stones across the lake. Yeah. All right. So you say that there should be monuments in general.
Yes, I believe so. Yeah.
And what do you think? Like, you think that they what purpose do you think they serve?
Well, I think they serve as a recognition of either people who fought in wars or people who accomplished something, or whether it could be an inventor, or a musician, or anybody of prominence that gave something to this country or to this world.
I agree. I agree. Telling the.
When you hear the word monument, what do you think of? Do you have a personal connection to any monuments or memorials?
I don't have a personal connection to monuments or memorials, and when I think of them, I know that they're very controversial. So that's sort of what I first think of, is the controversy over them.
When you hear the word monument, what do you think of? Do you have a personal connection to any monuments or memorials?
So when I think about monuments, I'm not really sure what I think of, except, you know, big stone things, I guess. Do I have a personal connection? Well, many of us have family members who have stone markers, gravestones in cemeteries, and I have a number of family members who are buried around New England, and some of them have grave markers and some of them don't, so I guess that counts as a personal connection. I also grew up in a New England town where there were lots of historic gravestones, some of which are really, really interesting to read and look at. So I do have that connection. But in addition, as I was telling Lawrence earlier, I have a connection to the monument at Battery Park in New York on the, it's for soldiers and sailors and merchant marine and Coast Guard people lost in the North Atlantic. And my Uncle Arthur, who was my father's immediate younger brother, is on one of the stone markers there. And I discovered it quite by accident as a tourist in New York about, 25 years ago, and took a picture and sent it to my dad. And he was really touched to know that there was this memorial to his brother, who was in the Army Air Corps, was in a plane that went down over the North Atlantic between Newfoundland and England in 1943, I think, in April of 1943. So.
Building on that, can you share the history of memorialization and monuments in Japan?
Mm-hmm. Sure. Actually, before 1868, monuments were really not a part of Japan. Monuments became part of the landscape of modern Japan after 1868, after the Meiji Restoration, which was Japan's political revolution, and the government's efforts to create a modern nation state. And part of creating a modern nation state is creating a national memory. And so the government set out in the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s to create monuments that worked to advance the cause of building unity and pride among the populace, because a lot of these monuments were meant to elicit and grow nationalism, feelings of pride in one's Japaneseness, So they really started to appear during that time. A lot of the early monuments were of figures from Japan's past who were presented as particularly loyal to the state or to the government or to the shogun, who was the head samurai. And the reason that they wanted to create these monuments was because they wanted the people of Japan to be loyal to the new government. So they put these monuments around Japan of loyal figures to make loyalty an important part of the present, not just an important part of the past.
Can you share the history, it does not have to be comprehensive, of memorialization and monuments in Latin America?
Oh, okay. So in Latin America, as well as in the United States, there have been lots of memorials constructed. I mean, the big memorials that you might think of are Maya glyphs and Maya and Aztec pyramids, right, in Mexico and Central America. We know now that some of them are, especially in the Maya stelae that they've found, they're monuments to particular people, right? Because they're carved in stone, they tell us a lot about the people of the time period in ways that we don't necessarily see indigenous people in, say, Brazil or to some extent the Caribbean and the east coast of the United States being recognized. It was really hard to avoid understanding that there were people in Mexico and the Andes and parts of Central America before the arrival of Europeans.
Okay. Do you think the British Museum should retain objects it stole from indigenous peoples around the world? How do you think the British Museum should reckon with its complicity in imperialism, if at all?
I think that they should give them all back. I don't think they should retain them. And I think a way that they could deal with it is by maybe doing an exhibit about where those items came from and how they were gotten, and to acknowledge that they were obtained through imperialism, through force, often through violence. So there's lots of places the British went where they did take objects by force after either defeating countries, like in China. They took a lot of the imperial objects out of China after they defeated the Chinese, or, for example, in unequal treaties in India. So the Kohinoor diamond is a really famous example, and that's not in the British Museum. That's the British monarchy still has that, and it was taken after a treaty that was signed with a 10-year-old who was, basically forced, like, either you sign this treaty and give us this diamond, or we'll invade your country and take it away from you. So I don't think they have a right to have that. And the British said, oh, he gave the diamond willingly, but it wasn't willing. It was by force. So I think that the British monarchy and the British Museum and any museums that have these items should acknowledge that.
Can you share the history surrounding the fall of monuments and anti-communist uprisings, especially in post-communist Eastern Europe? I'm thinking like 1989, 1991.
Right, exactly. In both of those years, in Eastern Europe in 1989, when puppet communist regimes fell, and in 1991, when the Soviet Union imploded or collapsed, monuments of Soviet heroes, most notably, most obviously Lenin, were conspicuously, publicly, deliberately, joyously destroyed, thereby signifying a complete rejection of communism, not just politically but morally.
What do you think we should be done to controversial monuments? Should they be torn down, put in a museum, or do you have any other ideas what should happen with them?
I think they probably should be put in museums or monument parks because they are historical objects, so they shouldn't be destroyed. But they're objects that tell you a lot about the time period in which they were created, not so much about our time period today. And one place I went to that I thought was fascinating was outside of Budapest in Hungary. And they had a Soviet statue park. So they had taken all of their statues of Stalin and Lenin, all of the monuments from the communist period, and they put them in this statue park so that people could go and look at them as historical objects and understand the history of the Soviet period. But they were taken out of the center of the city because they really didn't represent what people were, people's concerns of the present day. They were actually historical objects. So I think that they should be put in museums or statue parks or someplace that people can look at them, but, take it out sort of the center of towns and cities.
So people hear the argument of taking down monuments is erasing history.
Mm-hmm.
What is your opinion on, do you think they erase history, or what do you think?
It's not an erasure, it's more of a revision. When we think about taking down controversial monuments, for example, when we think about Robert E. Lee in Richmond, Virginia, or when we think about monuments even on college campuses, it's telling the honest history, revising the history, and letting the public know that there's a way to tell the history, right? Even with that, you can still tell the change over time. Even if, for example, you remove the statue, but you may keep the base, right? You can still use that to tell the story of change over time, right? You still have the original foundation, but you can still put in a revised or an honest or a modern context into that. So that, it's not exactly erasure, it's revision, telling it honestly, in my opinion.
What do you think we should do with controversial monuments? Should they be torn down? Should the plaques be added? Should they be put in a museum?
Well, it's an interesting question. I think it depends on what kind of monument it is. If it's a statue, that's easy enough to put in a museum and use it as a source of education and debate. If it's something like Yasukuni Shrine, which is an entire shrine that takes up a fair amount of land in Tokyo, I think it's a little bit harder to do something like that to a Yasukuni Shrine. I certainly feel when I take students to Yasukuni Shrine, which I've done, I've taken Central students there on 4 different occasions, on 4 different trips to Japan. I try to counterbalance the story of the war that's going to be presented at the museum at Yasukuni Shrine with a different history. Not necessarily a right one, but a different history, so that they see these monuments not as statements of truth, but as arguments about the past. And that Yasukuni Shrine is one argument, but it's not the only argument about Japan's wartime past. I really don't feel that these monuments should be torn down, because I don't think, even if you tear them down, the history that they represent is still with us. And I think it's much better to confront that history rather than to try to erase it or squash it or destroy it. I really think that the only way to get beyond the controversies that often surround monuments is through conversation and dialogue rather than destructive action.
I do think that monuments tell history, but I don't think they tell the whole narrative of it. I think monuments are examples of a person or a group's perspective on an event or a figure, but I don't think that perspective often encompasses the entire narrative of what actually happened or what the reason is they're commemorating it for. Like a good example would be like a Christopher Columbus statue. Most of them are often commemorating, either Italian heritage or like exploration into the New World, but they're not telling the fact that Columbus massacred a bunch of indigenous people.
Should there, do you think there should be even like monuments in general, like to people or to certain events?
You know, I think there should be monuments. I think, again, I'm going to kind of repeat on it, but it's they tell us a whole lot of history and what's in the past. Now, you know, some of that is good, some of that is not good. I think with the whole woke time we're in right now, a lot of it is not good. Some of it I believe in as being not good. Others I think that should be here.
How do you think we should deal with controversial monuments? Should we tear them down, place them in museums, put up plaques, etc.?
I think we should be very careful, very selective about which monuments we tear down. It's very easy to apply contemporary morality to figures living a long time ago and in very different circumstances. And it's really unfair to judge these individuals by standards that not only didn't exist when they were alive, but were, in some cases, literally inconceivable. So, at a time, for example, when serfdom in Russia was considered acceptable morally, there were monuments to tsars who either put in place or perpetrated serfdom, which we today consider evil. The same would apply for slavery. But I don't think that monuments to these individuals, I'm thinking particularly of Peter the Great here, should be torn down. I think that's an act of stupidity. It's an act of nihilism. It's an act which denies history and its complexity. It denies the complexity of human beings generally, not just historical actors. And I think that's exceedingly foolish and counterproductive. Where these monuments go once they're torn down, if they shouldn't be torn down, or even if they should be torn down, I think I don't really care much about that. They should not have been torn down in the first place. And I would say, speaking not as a historian, but as an observer, that the tearing down of monuments by young people and others who know nothing or little or nothing about the history surrounding the individuals whose monuments they are tearing down show themselves to be, again, nihilists, interested in destruction for its own sake. And I find those kinds of actions absolutely abhorrent.
So what should be done with controversial monuments? Some people have had the answer of putting them in museums, kind of just like taking them down, like on like general, like what do you think should be done with controversial monuments?
Controversial monuments, taking them out of a public view, right, is still leaving them on a pedestal, is definitely not the option. With museums, that can be more of a curated, I guess, place in which it is by admission, right? Whether it's paid admission or whatever the case may be. But once again, it's still putting it into context, right? If, let's say, you take the Robert E. Lee Monument, right, in Richmond, and you put it into a private museum, it is then, I feel, the responsibility of that institution to tell the history of that monument. Why that particular monument, right? It may not be the base and the statue, but just the statue alone, right? You still need to tell that story. I feel that that's the responsibility. That's just me being a public historian. But if you're putting it into a private space, then you have the responsibility of still telling the story, even if it's in a private space.
I don't think taking down a monument or a statue erases history. Obviously, the event that is being, I guess, commemorated, or the figure that's being celebrated, they still existed, it still happened, but removing a statue or a monument shows the change of thinking as a collective society, that we are able to recognize that something that that figure or that event represents should not be portrayed as being something great. Yeah.
Okay. What do you think should be done with controversial monuments like we were talking about Christopher Columbus? Do you think, like...
Yeah, I think, you know, growing up in New Haven and going to Worcester Square, and we used to celebrate Columbus Day in New Haven with parades and a whole lot. And, you know, again, it was a celebration. It was a, you know, mostly at that time, it was an Italian heritage thing with Christopher Columbus. You know, as for, you know, what he did, obviously, I've seen a replica of one of the ships when I was in Spain doing basketball, and, you know, bringing some of the indigenous Indians or indigenous Americans back with him on that. You know, again, we didn't live in that time. You know, that was not, you know, that time is gone. Should we learn from it? Yes. Should it dominate what we do now? No. I believe some of the statues in the South in particular concerning the Civil War, I totally agree with taking some of those down. Because you know, what the Civil War really meant, I think, to our country. And yeah, so I believe in that. As for some of the other ones, no. And I don't believe in taking the Christopher Columbus one down, so.